My guest today is Courtney Sullivan, a New York Times best-selling author whose books have not only been Reese Witherspoon book picks twice, but have also been optioned by Reese's production company. Today, we talk about how to know when an idea is right, doing research and writing stories in layers, the most important guiding principle to hold on to in a creative career, the coolest, most unexpected things that have happened to Courtney in her writing career, and so much more. Courtney was so fun and easy to talk to. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey, Courtney, welcome to Creative Inspired Happy. I'm so happy to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm such a fan of yours and of this podcast. So glad to be here.
I'm so flattered. So excited. So, I want to talk about The Cliffs, which is your brand new book that has been out for a little while now. Reese's book club pick, another one. But first, I have a question for you from one of our community members, Mesa F. And she says she always loves to hear the origin story for writers. How did you begin, years ago? I think 2010 was maybe when your first book came out. And
hmm
yeah, just talk about maybe how you started before that and up to 2010.
I love that question because I think there's so much about the process of being a writer that is sort of mysterious. And it's very different than becoming a dentist or something, right? Where there's kind of one path to doing it. In our case, there are many paths to be how you can become a writer. For me, I think like most writers, I started out as a reader first and just loved books. As a little kid, I loved books and started writing stories and plays and poems at a very young age. Um, and actually, when I was in fourth or fifth grade, a writer came and spoke at my school. This was a woman, I can't remember her name, which is so sad, but she wrote a young adult series and it had something to do with wolves. I can't quite remember what the details were, which is very me, but she did change my life because she talked about how she was a writer and that was her job and how her days were spent sitting at the kitchen table telling stories and drinking tea with her dogs at her feet. And I was like, okay, that's great. Sign me up for that job, please. And I guess it had never really occurred to me, even though I loved books, that somebody got paid to write those. So once I realized that, I was absolutely thrilled by the idea. Um, so it was something I really wanted from the time I was a kid, although I also wanted to be an actress and a hairstylist and a fashion designer. So I had a lot of aspirations and I thought I could do all of them at once. Which actually, when you're a writer, you sort of can, because you can, be through a character, you can sort of dip into worlds. When I went to college, I went to Smith College in Western Massachusetts, and I, every time a writer would come to campus, I'd basically ask this question. I would go and ask them, how did you become a writer? Because I didn't know any writers personally. Most of them, now they were from a previous generation, so I wasn't really factoring that in. Most of them told me they got their starts in magazines. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do that. And my first job in New York was at a lore magazine where I didn't think that was a direct path to becoming a fiction writer, but actually, I did learn a lot of really valuable skills for writing and editing in that job. And then I worked at the New York Times as a researcher and fact checker for 4 years. And while I had that job, I was writing my first novel, Commencement, at night and on the weekends, and about half of my second novel, Maine. And then I quit my day job when I got a contract for Maine and have been writing fiction as my job ever since.
So you published Commencement first, and then when you got the contract for Maine, that's when you finally decided, you know what, I'm going to be a fiction writer full time.
Yes, because financially, even though I was paid more than I'd ever been paid before for anything for Commencement by a lot, I mean, I had these practicalities. I had a huge amount of college loan debt. I used my first book advance to pay that off, which was really thrilling because if I hadn't gotten that big chunk of money, I'd still be paying that off, I think, probably forever. So, yeah, I had to stay in my job. It was funny because, as you know, I mean, with books, even if your book is a bestseller, it's not like you just have barrels of money, surrounding you immediately. So when my first novel came out, I was working at the New York Times, and I was all of a sudden getting wonderful press and reviews and things I really hadn't even known to hope for at that time, because I really didn't know much about the business of publishing. I truly was still in the stage of, I just like writing stories and I'd love to be a published author. But I wasn't savvy about it in the way that I later look back and see, oh, many young fiction writers were sort of, that was a community, and I was not part of that community at all. Um, Later I became more of a part of it, but at that time I didn't know anyone else who had a novel coming out or any of that. So I got all this wonderful press, and my coworkers were like, are you going to quit your job? And I was like, no, because I can't turn this good review into a check, unfortunately. So it took another couple of years before I was able to switch over and have that sort of financial confidence that, okay, I can do this now.
That makes a lot of sense. So you had mentioned that the old school way of becoming a fiction writer was to start in magazines, and that's kind of the path that you went. What do you think is the new school? Is new school a term?
Yeah.
The new school way of doing things?
I do not know. I think I think there's still a number of paths a person can take, right? I think obviously now it's really good to have, I guess, a built-in social media presence, which didn't really exist when I first got into the business. But I think it depends on the kind of book you're writing too. If you're writing a literary novel, I don't know if that matters quite as much. Um, I think maybe finding that community. I mean, when I look at myself in my 20s, I think I wish I had spent a little less time in bars and a little more time in bookstores, because especially in New York where I lived then, um, those people are very accessible. Any night you want, you can go to Books or Magic and meet not only an author, but probably their agent, their editor, and all their other author friends. And I think just kind of sitting and listening and asking these sorts of questions is a good place to begin. When I graduated from college, I did the Columbia Publishing program. Do you know that program?
No, tell me about it.
So it used to be called I think it used to be called the Radcliffe Publishing Program, and then they moved it to Columbia. And it's basically, I mean, for me, I didn't have connections in this industry at all. So if you're that person, it's kind of like pay for this expensive summer program, and then we will put you in front of the right people to interview for jobs. I mean, that's not exactly how they would explain it, but you spend a summer meeting all these power players in the industry, in books and magazines and newspapers. And then, oh, not newspapers, just books and magazines. And then at the end, there's a big career fair. And that's how I got my first job at Condé Nast. But I remember talking to this young woman in that program, and I was so freaked out. I was like, I don't understand. How do you do it? Like, how do you go from never having a byline to getting a byline? Let alone a book deal. And we happened to be walking by a newsstand as we were having this conversation. Sorry, and she like gestured toward the newsstand and said, "See all those magazines and newspapers? And if someone had to write every word that's in them." And so it was kind of this magical, like, demystifying moment for me, where it was like, it is hard to break in, but also there's always a need for content. There's always a need for storytelling and words. I mean, it is frustrating that what one gets paid per word hasn't changed for, I think, 30 years or something when you're writing for a mainstream publication. And then it's often even less when you're writing for certain online publications.
Yeah, and so like even for novelists, so much of the work we do, especially at the beginning of our careers, it's all for free, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
no one's paying you to write it. You don't know if this book is going anywhere. And so, like you said, you were not actually part of a community yet. You didn't know anyone who were writers when you were writing commencement. Is that right?
Yep.
So I read somewhere online that you did 15 drafts of commencement before you even sent it to your editor, and then you revised together. Is that typical of your process, or what has changed since your first book to now?
Well, I have been really, really fortunate in that I've published now 6 novels, and they've all been with the same agent and the same editor. And so we've all worked together for so long now, for 15 years. And it's, I think it gets easier. I mean, every book is difficult in its own way, and every book brings its own challenges, but you also realize that, um, the reward for finishing a book is to briefly be like, hooray, I finished a book, and then start another book. And that's if you're lucky. So you will always be at some point in the process, right? And so I think just knowing that is helpful. And I think there's a certain shorthand that we've developed working together over time that's really wonderful. Um, and yes, I had met my agent when I was probably about 20 years old, but it was 8 years later that my first novel came out. So it was definitely a process.
Oh, wow. Wow. And did you sign with your agent back then, or was it just kind of your process of getting to know the publishing world and later that connection was made when you had something to publish?
So when I was in college, I interned at the Atlantic Monthly magazine. And not to be obsessed with all things financial in this story, but I feel like that's an important thing that we don't talk enough about. And I love that you do talk about it on your podcast. So I did this internship at the Atlantic, a summer internship, and it was unpaid, as many of them were and still are. Um, but Smith College had and still has this wonderful program called Praxis, where they will pay you to do an unpaid internship so that you are able to be there and still earn money. So when I was at the Atlantic, most of the interns were only there a day or two a week because they had to make money elsewhere. And I was there all the time because it was a job for me. And so I feel like just because I was this constant presence, I got assigned a lot of interesting things. And at one point, the fiction editor, Michael Curtis, his assistant went on maternity leave, and I took over for her for the rest of that summer. And so that was this wonderful opportunity to work with him, and he was so kind, and he was sort of terrifying to me, but really very kind. And he asked me if I was a writer and read some of my stories, and ended up passing them along to another editor there, who in turn asked me if she could give them to a young agent who had also been an intern there, who was just starting out. And that agent was Brittany Bloom, who is still my agent now. So we met 23 years ago.
Okay, what I love so much about this story is that you didn't set out specifically like I'm going to meet this agent. And it's really that you put yourself in positions where opportunities might be possible. And maybe not even the opportunities that you imagined. You didn't go to the Atlantic Monthly thinking like, you know what? I'm going to work for this editor and then
Right.
he's going to connect me to an agent. And I think so much about publishing is actually kind of just like luck and being in the right place.
Oh, yeah.
But sometimes people take that negatively and they'll think, well, like that's not fair, like I'm not lucky. But I do think that like your approach to it is how luck happens when you
Mhm.
just keep on putting yourself out there. And sometimes things don't happen, but then sometimes they do, and you have no way of knowing how it's going to play out further
Yeah.
down in your career.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Because if I had gone into that summer thinking, I'm going to get a literary agent out of this, probably never would have happened. But that's quite right. I think is just kind of putting yourself in those places. And so I think at the very least, going to a bookstore event, going and meeting authors frequently, getting to know the booksellers, all of those things I do believe are helpful. And also maybe, getting into a writers group of some kind, whether it's in person or virtual. These days we can do so much at a distance. Um, yeah, so I think just kind of putting yourself in the presence of writers and editors and agents, and you don't have to necessarily pay tons and tons of money to do that. You don't need a fancy MFA to do that. There are a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm going to just plug Creative Inspired Happy here because we're also an online community. So anyone who wants to
Yay!
come hang out with us, they should do that. And that's what I'm trying to do, right? Is build
I
this
love
community
that.
virtually that I had kind of locally. And I found my community also through the local bookstore. Like I
Mhm.
just our bookstore allowed you to start your own book clubs. and then they would put
Cool.
whatever your book club pick was on their shelf, and then people could find you and come hang out with you when you want, if they wanted to read your book. And so I started a book club in the Bay Area, and that's kind of how I tapped into this whole community. Yeah, and then the bookseller there, the events director at Kepler's, she came to my book club once, and then she liked me, and she was like, you know what, we're looking for a conversation partner for when authors come on tour. And so I became that person. I did a lot of events with authors on tour, before I had an agent, before I had
I
a book
love
deal.
that.
Yeah, so it's really, I think it's that kismet, right? It's like putting yourself out there in the book world, and some things just magically happen sometimes. You
Yes.
just don't know.
Yes. I mean, and I think there's what's that quote that's like a very sort of dad thing to say about, inspiration and perspiration or something. It's like something along the lines of like you must, you have to sort of believe in a little bit of luck and magic, but also you have to put in the work. So I think part of it is often people will kind of want to talk to me about, like, can I take you to coffee because I'd like to write a novel, but they're not writing. They're not really spending any time writing, or even kind of, they just really want to write a novel. And I think there are all these, there's certain things in life. Like I now live in Massachusetts. I used to live in Brooklyn, and the New York City Marathon went right by our apartment every year. And every year for one day, I'd be like, wow, this is so inspiring. I really want to run a marathon. And then the
Yes.
next day, I'd be like, no, I'm not even going to run like 3 blocks. So I'm never going to run a marathon. I think we all just use our time however we use it. The people who run marathons are able to do so because they dedicate so much time and effort and energy to doing that. And that's part of writing a novel, too. It's like, I don't know. I think in my 20s, I would spend the weekends just in my apartment writing my novel and have certain guidelines for myself. Like, I must see one person a day, have a conversation. Um, so there are these sacrifices involved in the actual work of the work, especially if you have a full-time job or other demands on your time. And it just becomes, is that the thing that you want to dedicate yourself to?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about The Cliffs, which is your most recent novel. Tell us about what The Cliffs is about.
So The Cliffs is about a house on the coast of Maine, and all the women who've lived in this house and on this land over 400 years. The protagonist, Jane, is the only main character in the book who doesn't live in the house or on the land, but she discovers it. It's abandoned. She discovers it when she's in high school and returns 20 years later to find that the house has been purchased and renovated by this woman, Genevieve, who now believes that because of something she did in the process of renovating, the house is haunted. And she hires Jane, who is an archivist and way overqualified for the job, to research the history of the house. And through that, we sort of have all the women who've lived there in conversation with one another, and kind of solving the mysteries that occurred there over hundreds of years.
So I have to tell you, I'm a little bit afraid of ghosts. And I'm partway through The Cliffs, and there was one night where I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and I have this irrational belief that ghosts live in mirrors at night. It goes back to like first grade, the whole Bloody Mary thing in the
Of
mirror.
course, of
And
course.
so I was in the middle of reading The Cliffs, and I went into the bathroom, and I can, it's usually I try to keep the lights off so I don't wake up too much. But I just freaked out that night. I'm like, oh my God, ghosts! And I had to turn on
No,
all the lights.
oh no.
But it is testament to your incredible writing. And I mean, it's not a ghost story, right? This is not like a horror or anything like that. But I'm curious how you came up with this idea, or when do you know an idea is a good one, and how that process is when are you iterating with your editor? Are you saying, hey, I have this idea, and then you start talking about whether, and you develop it with her, or do you come with something fully baked?
So I think that, having a few books under my belt now, it's kind of nice because I'm starting to see the patterns and how it works. And so um, it's usually for me, there's a story that's kind of interesting, percolating, it might not be the right moment to write that particular story for whatever reason, but it stays with me. And there are a few of those. where it's kind of like, I wonder if I will write that someday. And this is one of those that probably about 12 years ago, my husband and I and this other couple, our very good friends, were in Maine, and we discovered this abandoned house, very similar to the one in the book. And we became kind of obsessed with this place. There is something so alluring, appealing about an abandoned house. It's like that sort of Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, R.L. Stein, Scooby Doo, whatever, whatever your source is. Um, and we would go back every summer. This would be the first thing we would do on vacation, is go check out the house and see how it's doing. And then one year the house was gone. It had been torn down. And in its place was the foundation of what was clearly going to be a massive, massive new build house. And that got me writing. It had been many years that I thought, I wonder if maybe I'll write about that house. But the house being torn down made me start writing about the house and what had been in it. And the house was sort of the first character in a way. And then it was still a few years after that that the actual human characters came to be in the story.
Oh, that's really fascinating that it started without the characters.
Mm-hmm.
I really
Yeah.
love hearing actually that this book took a long time to just kind of marinate in your brain and become what it really was. Did you do research on like historical aspects of Maine, or how do you approach your books? Because just reading your work, it's very layered. And I have this, and now that you've talked about like the house came first and the characters came later, I get that. I can feel that as a writer, you're constructing different layers and then putting them on top of each other until you have something that's very, very rich and very deep, like
Yeah.
all the generations of women, So yeah, do you do research?
Oh my gosh, I do so much research. So as I said, my my job at the New York Times, my title was researcher, and I did research for two of the opinion columnists there, and always kind of thought it would be so nice to be able to just write fiction and not have to do all this research all the time. And then, of course, the second I left my day job, I was like, oh, I miss doing research. I love research. And I'm really good at doing research too, I have to say. I mean, whether it's for my books or just I personally am going down some rabbit hole that, originated in a People magazine article. I mean, I can find just about anything. My secret fantasy job is private detective, which hopefully maybe one day I'll get to be. Um, but yes, in the case of this book, I started writing it the summer of 2020, and we were living for a brief time in the Albany area. And it was me and my husband, and our kids were not yet 2 and not yet 3 when the world sort of shut down for COVID. And a couple of places where I could take my kids because playgrounds were closed, everything was closed. I could take them to the Shaker Village in Albany, which is now a museum, no longer, actually lived in by Shakers. It was closed, but they have all this beautiful outdoor space, and my kids would be running around, and I'd be reading every little plaque and thinking, oh, this would be an interesting feature in a novel. And it also reminded me that when I was a kid, my mom took us to Sabbath Day Lake, Shaker Village in Maine. And so I started, that was one rabbit hole that I would go down late at night while we were sort of, stuck in this house together, not seeing friends, not seeing anyone. We were staying in a family friend's house. And it was interesting because we were in this suburban neighborhood, but you weren't even talking to your neighbors if you knew them and loved them, let alone these random people who just showed up. So we were really isolated. And I also was reading a book at the time called The In-Betweens, which is written by a friend of mine named Mira Pitassin. And it's about this spiritualist camp where mediums have gone every summer in Maine for over 100 years, well over 100 years. And um, that had me thinking too that, these interesting sort of subcultures that exist in Maine that were once very robust in both cases. The Shakers are now down to 2 Shakers. There was actually an article in the Times about it this weekend. Um, in the whole world, there are only two Shakers, and they live in Maine at Sabbath Day Lake. And uh, Camp Etna, similarly, the medium camp, is still there, but it's quite a bit diminished from what it was around the time of the Civil War at its height. And so suddenly, these worlds that truly do exist in Maine, uh, I found myself wanting to write about characters who live in those worlds. And this house that I had written down so long ago became kind of the vessel for all these different stories, and women who had come from these places and how they came to the house and all of that.
Do you think about genre when you're writing, or do you worry about like, okay, this might be historical, but it's also women's fiction, but then I'm adding in spiritualists and maybe or maybe not a ghost? Like, does that come into play as you're creating a story?
No. No.
I love
Um,
that.
I know. I feel like when I wrote my first novel, and my second, really, again, I was just so very green to what the industry is like. I really didn't even know about, oh, this will be categorized by some as women's fiction and some as chick lit. And I remember seeing my book Commencement in a bookstore, and it had a little staff recommendation, but it called it like some kind of a mystery. And I was sort of like, oh my gosh, what am I? And I think realized kind of early on that I'm just going to write the books that I want to write. And then someone else will decide where they go. Um, which I'm not totally, zen about that. It can be extremely frustrating to feel like you've written something layered and sometimes historical. Um, and because you're a woman and you write about women, it's categorized in a certain way. That can be very frustrating. Um, but it's funny, on Amazon now they have so many categories for some reason.
Hmm.
And authors will often say, oh, look, I'm number one. But then it's like number one in knitting, and trauma narrative or something. Um, so for a while, The Cliffs was number one in horror fiction. And I was like, it's not a what? It's literally not even
It's
remotely
not
is it a
horror, no.
horror novel. Um, so I think that that's just like the path to madness, but it's also I think it comes up, in conversations early on in the process with my editor where she'll be kind of like, but it's not really like a ghost story, is it? We were sort of back and forth on that. Um, but I think once you have, it's just, again, it's like about doing the work because once you have the book in hand and it's not just like a concept or an idea, I think there's more, at least in my experience, there's more willingness for the editors, the readers to say, oh, okay, well, I get it. This is still a you book, even though it might have sounded in the pitch a little bit of a departure. And I also feel like I'm 43. I've been doing this, I've been lucky enough to do this since I was 28. Like, I can't just write the same book 10 more times. It just sounds so boring.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually, you brought up your readers and that it seems like they have followed you. Do you ever get emails or messages from your readers saying, Courtney, what the heck are you doing? Or,
No, I think because I no longer have a direct email on my website. Maybe that's why. Um, no, not really. I think my last book, Friends and Strangers, this was a book that really grew organically out of the sort of moment of new motherhood that I was in at the time. And it was the only book that I didn't do a lot of research for. And looking back, I realize it's because like my whole life was sort of I was doing research just by like living at that moment. I was in a new phase that I just had not experienced, and every single day was something brand new to me. I just happened to be living it, not just reading and researching about it. Um, but that book I feel like was really different, and that was probably the one I would have expected people to be like, what is this? This doesn't seem like what you've written before. Um, but I didn't get that much of that. I mean, I do think as readers, I think there is a very small number of authors where, um, readers come back again and again and again, and that author becomes sort of a brand. and you know what they're going to give you and you buy every book they write. But certainly I think, unfortunately, most readers are not that loyal to any particular author. And I'm like that myself as a reader, so I can't be angry about it. There are authors where I absolutely love something they've written, and then the next one comes out and I think, that doesn't sound that interesting to me. I'm not going to read it. So I feel like, yeah, I mean, and also every book hits the moment, hits the moment it hits, comes out when it comes out, and you can never predict like what the world's going to want at that time. So I feel like you kind of have to forget about it and just write whatever it is that's like burning in you to be written at that time.
I really love that actually because it puts a lot less, it doesn't bring the audience into your workspace or into your home. For me, I work from home, like your kind of creative playground is yours.
Yes. Yeah, totally. I think you have to be very much aware of the art and the commerce both, but you can't let the commerce like slip in when you're creating the art because it has to remain fun. If it's not fun
Yes.
anymore, then that's not good. I have this picture on my desk. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It's this old photograph. I mean, it's just a picture of my friend and I making a snowman. And the reason I have it on my desk is because I look at it and I think, what were we doing? We were probably cold, we were probably freezing and wet and whatever, but we probably spent the entire afternoon making this snowman. And why did we make it? Why did we create this thing? We did it because it was fun. We were not expecting to win the Pulitzer in snowman making. We just thought it was fun, and hopefully you can capture a little bit of that while writing fiction because otherwise it's kind of like, what's the point, right?
Yeah, I love that because I was actually, my next question for you was going to be, what is your guiding principle as a writer? And it sounds like maybe that's it, that you need to still be enjoying it because this creative process, it without that little bit of joy, it loses part of its soul.
That's right, exactly. And again, I've been at this for a little while now, and like part of what's so nice I think about getting older is just learning things about, that you can only learn from having done them. And I've definitely had moments where, and I really appreciated this. I was listening to an episode of your podcast, and now I can't remember who the author was, but she was so honest about saying, yes, I've had some books that have been these massive New York Times bestsellers, and then others that haven't been. And you said to this person, but nobody else, no one knows that but you, and it's true. Um, every book has like its own little journey. And I think if you have one big hit, people assume all your books are a big hit. And hey, that's great. Let them think that. But it's rarely the case. Um, I had such huge numbers with relative to my other books, with my second novel, Maine. And I remember talking to a novelist much more experienced than I and kind of being disappointed that my next book didn't sell to that level. And she said, most writers get that once if they're really lucky, maybe twice. But unless you are someone with kind of a brand, and we're talking about maybe like 6 or 7 people, you know, um, each book is just going to be its own thing.
And really, I feel like the point is to be able to have a long career, right? And so to not put all of your hopes and dreams into any one book, but
Mm-hmm.
to hope that you get to keep doing this, right? Whether each individual book does well. And it's so hard. It's so hard not to put everything into every single book. I mean, like
It
you do
is.
when you're writing it, but I still make that mistake where every single book I think, oh, this one has to be the big one, you know?
Of course, me too. I mean, I sound like I am very removed from that. I'm not at all. I just, when I'm able to, when I'm in the thick of it, that's me completely. And then I can step back and be like, well, okay, and right now I'm in the middle of a really, what feels like a very long book tour, which started in the beginning of July and is going through October. And it's funny because when I'm out there, I mean, I love being in the moment of those events. They're wonderful. I love connecting with readers, but the getting to and from and the preparing and all of that, in those moments, all I want to be doing is sitting in my office writing. you know?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. Okay, my last question for you is what is the coolest thing that has happened to you or the most unexpected thing that's happened to you in this career? And you've had some big highlights.
Yeah.
So the Engagements was optioned by Reese Witherspoon's production company, Friends and Strangers, and The Cliffs were Reese Witherspoon book picks. You wrote the foreword for Anne of Green Gables at one point. Are those the coolest things, or is there something else that really kind of touched you?
I think that so you just kind of hit all the high points for me. When Reese Witherspoon optioned the Engagements, that was really thrilling, and I worked and spoke, worked really closely with her and would be like texting with her and talking to her, and that was really just so exciting and really a fantasy. um, and the getting asked to write the foreword to I wrote the forewords in the same year to Anne of Green Gables and Little Women, which are two of my
Oh
all-time
my
favorites.
gosh.
And I remember very clearly when I was asked to write a foreword to Little Women. My husband's from Iowa, and we were driving in Des Moines, Iowa. And I mean, I just remember exactly where I was when I opened up the email, and it was like, oh my God, that is just so thrilling. So I think that was a biggie. And we had this moment when Commencement came out. So I was 28 when that book came out. I had my first date with my husband the same week the book came out. So that was a big week in my life. And maybe a year later, I was at Smith College, and the book is, sort of set around a group of alums of Smith College. So I was at Smith in Northampton, Mass, to give a talk. And my husband, my boyfriend then, was with me. And later on, we were walking around, not on campus, but in town in Northampton. And this woman, young woman, walked past us, and she didn't even stop. She just said, "Thanks for writing it." And it was like, if my husband hadn't been with me, I would have been like, did I just dream that? And so it was just this very magical moment. And also, like, shocking to me that someone would know who I was. And, I don't know, it was interesting. She didn't want a signed book or a conversation. She just like said that. And I loved that. Um, and still to this day, my husband and I, it's sort of a joke. I mean, it's still, that means so much to me, but also it's become a joke in our house where one of us will say like, "Oh, thanks for doing the laundry," and the other one will say, "Thanks for writing it." It's just a thing that we say a lot.
I really love that because even though like the big external highs, like a Reese Witherspoon like option, those are so great. I really always come back to when you write a book and it touches one reader, like every single reader, they are an individual, complete human being.
Yeah.
And how incredible that we get to do this, right? Whether you sell 10 copies of a book and touch 10 actual people's lives
Yep.
or, 10 million copies, those are real people. And so I just, yeah, thank you for writing that.
I remember when my first novel was out, I was doing an event, and I was really nervous that no one was going to come. And a friend of mine who is a very well-known nonfiction writer, he had had a couple of huge best-selling books already at that time, and he said to me, he said, "I went once to all the way to LA to do a book event, and three people showed up." And he said, and my first reaction was I was so mad. Like, how, I can't believe this is so embarrassing. I just crossed the country and there's three people here. He's like, but then I thought to myself, in this city where there are so many things people could be doing right now with their time, these three people chose to come to this bookstore and meet me. And there's something really cool about that, And I don't know. I think of that often. Of course, you want there to be more than three people, but it's exactly as you said, to make that connection, with one reader is huge. It's a huge honor.
Yeah, it's amazing. I do feel so lucky that we get to do what we do. So,
Yes.
if people want to connect with you further, where can they find you online?
I'm on Instagram. Um, I'm still sort of on Twitter, but not really. I can't quite quit Twitter for some reason. But I don't really post, but I do read. But mostly Instagram, I would say, is the place where I spend time.
Okay, fantastic. I will drop those links into our episode notes.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with us. This was so fun, and you're so easy to talk to. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. So, if we're ever in the same place, let's please get together and have
Let's
coffee.
please do that. I would love that. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.
Take care, Evelyn. Thank you.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.